Hello, I'm Faye Soteri, International Senior Watch Buyer for the Watches of Switzerland Group. We're joined today by Bill Prince, watch journalist, acting editor-in-chief of Wallpaper magazine and long-standing friend of the business, and Mark Toulson, global watch buyer for the group. We're lucky enough just to have come back from Watches and Wonders, the first fair that we've been able to actually visit in a couple of years. And we're sitting here in our Regent Street VIP lounge with some new product. And today we'd like to talk about some of the trends we've seen, some of the new products, and how we thought the fairs went this year. You referenced colour with the new product we've seen. I thought it was a very big trend. It's not a brand new trend for the industry, but should we start with that one, or did you feel that was the most dominant trend of the fair this year and the new product that was launched? Because it wasn't just Watches and Wonders. We've also saw Omega launch products slightly before. Breitling did also. Not all watch brands are present at Watches and Wonders. Sure. However, the novelty selection and launches did start from towards the end of January with some of the LVMH brands, and then followed by Omega 6-8 weeks ago.
Not to answer that question, I was rather thinking about the sort of the globalization that has occurred in the appeal of watches from Instagram, etc. When particularly Chinese people started to buy watches in Europe, or they had a particular style, they were all quite classic. And I think the way people post stuff, to come back to your point about social media, there's lots of sports watches posted, and we've seen a shift when we had Chinese customers over the last recent years. They are moving into what we might have called more European watches, and I think to your point about how tastes have changed, I think the sort of the whole social media aspect and the fact that everybody is connected to somebody on the other side of the world, it has changed tastes, and I think that maybe that leads to the brands picking out certain directions.
I will answer your question. I think whether or not it was the dominant trend, it was clearly the one trend that if a brand hadn't or wasn't or isn't offering something in a one or other colourway that wasn't black, blue or white, it was noticeable. So I would suggest it has become endemic before it becomes generic. So there's a moment now where the customer would expect to see some variety, and whereas before they might be slightly bemused by the number of colourways that are now available, I think now they kind of expect to be able to select from a choice. I mean, look at the lovely Navitimes here. I mean, personally for me, this is a perfect confluence of two events. One is it's an anniversary, it's 70 years. It's a tool watch. It was originally devised to aid navigation, particularly in the air, or indeed only in the air. But at the same time, it is now being offered, as Mark has pointed out, in a really cleaned up dial, beautifully designed, beautifully executed, in a variety of dial colours. And I think those two elements together really we can fashion a sort of a where are we right now moment, which is the tool watch seems to be at the zenith of its appreciation, and therefore the excitement surrounding it. And I think that is what's bled into the social media furore around the 50th anniversary of the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, and obviously, and then you bring in the selection of Rolex each year with their tool pieces, and very quickly you can see where a lot of the sort of summary attention is going, and at the same time you're getting much more choice out of those pieces, and they're informing the entire market.
And brands are launching with confidence as well, I think. Whether the multiple watches that you were referencing earlier, Mark, in that clients are wanting more than one watch for various occasions. I think gone are the times where your first watch happens to be a black or a blue dial. Tag with their Aqua Professional 300 with the bright orange. That's going to be a great watch. They do those models very well, and they are tall watches. They're launching the professional collections this year when they started with them last year. So I think also the variety gives a bit more confidence, where you don't have to conform to a specific colour palette, or do you have to wear a conservative dial with a suit if you're depending on what your job is. But the colourways were prevalent. It wasn't just in dial options. I mean, Omega did the Speedmaster 57, and we've got the burgundy, the green, and the blue. I thought that launch was lovely, and it was sort of slightly more muted tones, because we're talking about colour a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean just bright pops of colour. And they were obviously loyal to the original model in the slightly smaller case size, just over 40 millimeters. Hublot in the ceramics that they do, also with the sapphire they do those in colours. Yeah. There's a lot going on aesthetically. The ceramics with IWC and their pilot watches, again slightly more muted, but coming away from the traditional models. And I thought I was really interesting for me. Colour, we're talking probably more dial lead and materials, but yellow gold in aesthetics making an appearance. No one launching with strength or a wide collection, but most of the key brands were launching a significant watch in yellow gold, whether it was the Yachtmaster from Rolex, whether it was the gold Speedmaster from Omega, the Chinois from Cartier. Cartier played with yellow gold a little bit, and Hublot launched earlier this year. They did the Spirit Classic Fusion chronograph and the Big Bang, all in yellow gold. We're just very familiar with rose gold or white gold in the industry. I think not many people, but it's interesting that colour is coming at us from a multitude of angles. Yeah,
I mean, I would agree. I mean, I thought the Hublot Red Magic Spirit of Big Bang, I mean, it was full on red. That was about as colourful as you can really get. But the variety of greens is still consistent. You know, the pistachio on the Navitimer that you referenced, and then obviously I think Patek introduced 4 green dial models from the 24 in steel. Up to the 5270 with that degraded green dial. That was a beautiful, really deep and gorgeous green. And then you mentioned about Cartier, blue ADLC on the Santos, so that you had a blue coating on the bezel on the Santos, which looks really cool. And that was obviously on metal rather than just a dial. So they were all interesting. Yeah,
it's true. Actually, you're right. It could be as bold as the Red Magic, or accented colour. But what we're coming away from is just very traditional black dial, blue dial on a watch. Or not coming away from, it's just adding to.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Faye, because you described it thus. Originally you had options in colour, but they were only presented through the use of precious metals. But now we have obviously access to ceramics and synthetic sapphires, which has brought the colour right through from the dial to the bezel to the entire piece. And I think that has opened up, and obviously it's opened up an absolute paint box of opportunity. And I think we'll only see more development within how actually the industry works, probably with colorists and even artists. I think we've seen certain examples of limited editions with contemporary artists, but I think artists themselves probably look at this piece of portable art as something that they can administer as well. So I take it back, it probably is by definition the dominant trend actually. I think there's nothing that's quite meeting the iterations, the frequency with which we see a colourway in a watch.
It's interesting you reference artists and how different, I wonder how different creative elements collide here, because whilst it wasn't this year, we've seen it with the Ronnie Woods collection for Braemont, where each dial he had influence over Sangbleu for Hublot. You know, they coordinate and they partner with the tattoo artist, don't they? So
they do. Felipe Pantone at Zenith has Murakami at Louis Vuitton. I mean, there are associations in play, and I think that perhaps what's enticing people who possibly wouldn't have looked at working with a watch is the fact that they can now experiment and use colour as part of that watch, whereas before they'd probably be limited by the choice of material, as you say. So I just have to agree completely. I mean, the lacquered pieces in the Santos collection at Cartier are stunning, and that is in essence is a colour piece as well.
Yeah, I thought it was curious. As a kind of going against the colour trend was Doxa, for example, who've had colourful dials all their life. All they introduced were the white dials, which I thought was kind of the white pearl collection, which I thought was which was rather fun because they were already there and have been there for quite a number of years.
Yeah, and with respect, as you say, have done a lot with colour and have helped bring colour back into tool watches. And to your point, Faye, I love the Aqua Racer 300, but orange is entirely defensible as a wear watch because it talks to the colour. How colour works underwater, and therefore this is orange for a reason. It's not orange because somebody chose orange. It works as a tool watch as orange. So it's everything plays into the strength of the authenticity of these pieces, I think, and
the legitimacy of the tool, I suppose.
Yeah, and there was some element of I suppose vintage colour, we might call it, in terms of sort of the copper dials or the rose gilt dials, as I think Patek called them. Vacheron had something as well, if I recall correctly, with a lovely copper dial. But the Patek, the 5172 chronograph, that was great with the copper dial and a white gold case. Really classic looking piece, and the sort of string shaped hands and the full figure dial. It did have that sort of vintage edge to it.
Yeah. No, that's the word, isn't it? Because I think people we've got used to the term retro, and that's not the same as vintage. Yeah. And we've seen some fantastic reimaginings of vintage watches, and we've seen salmon dials, which I think primarily have moved from the auction room into the design studio, simply because people have seen them as we get going back to the social media point, and it's adding another lustre to collections that are not retro, but they are repurposing vintage tools.
222 from Vacheron.
Yeah.
Well, there's. I'm personally have always been a fan of a vintage watch anyway. So that one spoke again, yellow gold. So it was not many that not in their collection. So colour from I could say the inside out because of the accents, as Mark referenced on the Santos. So slightly more subtle to dial colour to materials and the precious metal element. A lot of options there for our clients, and across great price points as well, which it's not restrictive only. What other trends did you feel were dominating this year?
Compared to a few years ago, there's what I would call authentic innovation, which is my way of describing something that there's purpose behind the decision taken to bring something new to market. I think with respect, we can go back a few years, and the industry was populated by, let's not say numerous, but several watches where you thought it's answering a question that's never been asked. And this time, every answer answers a question that we probably have been asking. And we saw it across the board, actually, and we see across different aspects of the industry. I suppose a brand that has innovation baked in is Tag Heuer. I mean, Avant technology is their defining mission. And this year they came with some fundamental step changes. I mean, they brought a lab-grown diamond piece in the Carrera collection, which is extraordinary. I mean, the dial is made entirely out of lab-grown diamonds. The crown has been carved out of a lab-grown diamond. It's amazing.
It's a solid diamond.
Yeah, and it's an extraordinary piece, and was obviously the pièce de résistance, and it was treated as such on the Tag Heuer stand and in the presentation that Frederic Arnault delivered around the watch. But I was actually blown away by a more humble piece, if one could describe it as such, which was the Aqua Racer 200 Solograph, which is powered by light. And again, it's an intervention into mechanical watchmaking at a Swiss watch fair that I think brought delight to people, because it arrives later in the year, and I can't wait to see it, and I can't wait to wear it. Actually, I think it's a very practical, very interesting watch. And we know that light-powered watches have existed before. Cartier brought one to market just the other last year. So we're not claiming great breakthroughs in watch technology, but it's interesting to see how experimenting with different power sources, different energy sources in this case, is bringing some generational shift in the way watches are being presented. And I think innovation, and then we can talk about other forms of innovation which tend to sit more within the sustainability end of the process, which is brands like Panerai, who've obviously done a great deal with e-steel, and recyclables in not just in their watches and their straps, which is obviously quite is not a commonplace, but is widely distributed throughout the industry now. You're now seeing it going into the packaging, which once upon a time used to mimic an old oak armchair, and now is this beautiful redesigned lightweight. Not designed to be disposed of, but perhaps even designed to be folded away. But either way, it's a very, very pertinent piece of the customer journey, that they're joining a brand that is determined to reduce its footprint. So I think innovation, not for the sake of saying, look what we can do or look what we've done, but for in service to, I suppose, reinforcing, in this case, the sustainability of an industry that can claim to be one of the most sustainable on earth, simply because its products last such a long time. Their dust-to-dust footprint on the planet makes them probably one of the most sustainable. And as we saw, with respect, during the last 2 years, because their supply chains are necessarily shorter, not exclusively, not across every band, but because supply chains compared to other industries that really suffered during the global lockdown because they couldn't access certain parts or certain materials, the Swiss watch industry is working on much shorter supply chains, which allowed them to keep producing watches, and that obviously aided and abetted the success that the industry's had over the last few years, in the last couple of years. So yeah, I think I saw a lot of innovation, and I can say, and I think that's reflected in the fact I saw far less pointless innovation. Ideas that weren't possibly going to fly, or at least weren't even going to go into production. Everything seemed to have a point.
And sometimes, whilst there's a client for everything, some of these products can be almost peacocking in terms of what the brands they're and showing off, and not showing off, but exploring and expanding on what they can do, because there does need to be a point of difference, but they stay within their DNA and their natural codes of their brands. But when they're reacting to a wider issue, so sustainability is global, and that's not going anywhere. It's the loyalty and how they're approaching it. It's not going to happen overnight, but let's start with the packaging, as you say. The E-Steel was launched a couple of years ago. We've seen a little bit from other brands, Oris with their recycled dial, and there's various other brands that do it with their straps. So we're seeing these little nods to, and in it becoming slightly more of influence within the industry, but they're taking it seriously, and I think that's but still staying loyal within their own language, I suppose. The Aqua Racer was that was, as you, I think,
of course,
a key model for you.
Yeah, and again, we were talking about the Aqua Racer King, the 1,000-meter fully professional Aqua Racer, and that had some interesting innovations in the sense that they were talking about a third-party movement they've introduced into Tag Heuer. There was a moment a few years ago when brands were not loath, but they were reluctant to discuss too much about how they saw certain elements of their business. Now it's a much more open-sourced, collaborative affair, and I think that speaks to a generational shift perhaps in some of the people who are involved in the brands, which we may come on and talk about. But to your direct point about innovation, yeah, and innovation doesn't have to be, as I say, the pursuit of something simply to demark oneself as someone who's innovative. The Cartier, who you may regard as one of the sort of landmark wristwatch manufacturers of the last 100 years, can still be extremely innovative in a purely technical sense. And I think we all were staggered by the Cuisine de Cartier squeezable watch. I think the term squidgy was used when it was presented to me, which is what was a word I've not seen bandied around at any watch fair before. But the case is malleable, and it was 3D printed in order to create the mesh into which 1,000 diamonds have been set. You really have to see the piece to understand the work involved, but you have to handle the piece to recognise quite how dramatic it is to pick a watch up that can actually bend in your hands. Previously, a watch that bent in your hand was something not to be taken away, but in this case, it was. So I think innovation at every level, almost in every department of the watchmaking world, you are seeing innovation. And because, as I describe it, because of this newfound transparency, you're often seeing this innovation for the very first time, because often it was just hidden away in the incremental improvement that came with mechanical watchmaking, which we perhaps as an industry, perhaps as interested in brands, we would talk about specific technological breakthroughs in terms of balance wheels and and hairsprings and certain other devices. But we didn't really telegraph that too much because it was such an internal conversation around how synthetics were being used in mechanical watchmaking. But now we can talk much more broadly about innovation within watchmaking, and I think the audience are very ready for it. Because to be fair, they've grown up with technology in the first instance, the younger market, and you know they expect innovation. They expect things to move on. They expect things to change, and the watch industry is really responding to that and saying we can show you something new, without breaking any of the codes that have kept us alive for the last century or so.
One of them could be a plasma tourbillon at 400,000 euros, but equally at the other end is that there was the very, very commercial piece that we've already referenced. You've talked about the Cartier Toulson, and I think that ties into the colour because they did one with diamonds and they did one with a multitude of different colour stones, so having a variety there. Shape and design also innovation was the more technical element that we saw. Aesthetically, did you see anything, did we see anything that was stepped away from the traditional round wristwatch?
I'll just come back to the Toulson actually, because to your point about how the sort of innovation there, I think it took them almost 3 years to develop the process to make that, and then it takes 22 hours to make the case. So that's quite some imagination to think about doing something like that 3 years ago, and then putting it into practice, and the shape was great.
And that's an important distinction, Mark, because I think we're not suggesting that all of this work has been done thanks to lockdown or due to lockdown or in response to lockdown. I think in 9 times out of 10 cases, the watches we saw were thought up and possibly even in production prior to the pandemic. But I think one piece, so it's interesting that perhaps colour was perhaps not an easy win or a quick fix, but with respect, coloured dials can be changed and changed up and down. But for Hublot to bring the square bang to market, that was a genuinely new model. And with respect, we didn't see a huge number of entirely new models from some of the larger brands. And to your point, yes, they had the tonneau case in the spirit of Big Bang. They have the round watches and the classic fusion, and now they've added the square. And I think that makes perfect sense. And it talks to the context of shape in watchmaking that I think, to mark your point about how watches gradually became synonymous with something that was generally gold or silvered in steel or white gold and round. And now Cartier have never lost that thread of producing watches that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily understood by their shapes, whether it's the tongue or the round. Now we're seeing brands exploring and experimenting and also joining that journey around shape. And I think, again, it's reflective of the fact that there's a confidence in the industry, and there's a real desire and a real appreciation of something different.
Yeah. I thought the square bang was great. I mean, it looks like a big bang, but it's square, and it sounds simple when you say it. But there's an awful lot of work gone into making that watch look like it does. It's really cool. It
looks like a Hublot as well. They haven't tried something new and come away from it. It almost looks like it's been part of their collection for a while. We didn't see many new families launched. In fact, I think it was the only one where there was a selection across the metals as well. You've got the Black Magic, and then working your way through the metal types. So a few options again for the clients, but they launched a Hublot that wasn't in their collection that looks like a Hublot and gives a point of difference from all the other Hublot models that, because they've got a vast catalogue anyway. But this is
it's a strong launch after the Integral, which came a couple of years ago with the integrated bracelet. I think which perhaps answered another need in the marketplace. But this, with respect, this is a watch that they clearly wanted to produce. And you know better than anyone what the percentage of sales of non-round watches are. It's not a home run much of the time. I mean, to move away from a round watch. The square we know from the Santos, we're familiar, and Bell and Ross in the past. So it's not an outlier in terms of the shape. Obviously, a square is hardly an outlier shape after all, but it's not something that you would perceive as being something that was actually core to your range. But clearly, Hublot decided it does fit because it fills the space which a square watch, which was lacking.
I think it goes back to the point of clients wanting more than one watch if they're able to, because this might not be your first watch. Probably won't be if we look at sort of the statistics. There's nothing wrong if it is, but it just gives that additional variety and point of difference from a market which is responding to demands and creativity, and whether it's innovation or colour or design that we're talking about. So yeah, we weren't expecting that, but it was welcome. I'm going to back this. I think it's going to do really well for Hublot. What were the other themes that you felt were relevant and prevalent at the fair? Or not just at the fair, the sort of the products we've seen launch earlier this year. So we're not just through Watches and Wonders.
I think we might think that slightly awkwardly, considering the last couple of years that we've had, but a lot of watches that you could relate to in terms of travel and adventure, GMTs and diving watches and that sort of adventurous type of watch. I think there's probably something there that's worth exploring.
I'm going to go back on my own thesis, which is that all of this was planned long before the pandemic, but at the same time I want to believe that the industry have recognised our need to get back out there and start living the life that was put on hold. And one of those elements is obviously travel, and there were some wonderful GMT pieces, and including my favourite piece of the fair we'll come on to, but it's exceptional anyway, the number of dive watches that are on the market currently. I mean, across the board, and the quality and the price point generally, it makes it, I think, if anyone was ever fearful of buying a dive watch as their first watch, they would have no concern now, because it's becoming one of the sort of central pillars of not just a watch collection, but just watch ownership. You could easily start, ideally, because it's a very robust watch in the first instance, and given the lives that some people live, you know, you want something that's going to get through the hardest yards of your day, rather than have to be literally benched while you go and do something like cycle to work. So clearly that there's a market for it, but talking specifically about the GMT, that speaks to something directly from the heart, which is this idea of journeying and international travel. Of course, it plays back into the history of the tool watches that we were talking about, and the advent of same-day international travel, which required you to be resetting your watch after a few hours, sometimes by up to 8 hours. So its purpose is completely enshrined in tool watchmaking, as we come on to Rolex. But at the same time, there is now many different iterations, and I think we all fell in love with the Patek Philippe 5326G, which comes with an annual calendar and a GMT function in the same watch, at Patek at first. But we were also completely blown away by the design, which is a redesigned Calatrava case with a Clou de Paris side, and the dial, which was, we've been talking about dials a lot, we've been talking about colour a lot, but this is a dial that sort of combined texture, a grained dial as they call it, but also with a deep, dark bitumen, charcoal hue, which it was stunning, and it was matched for the purposes of the show on a beautiful sort of safari calf strap, which also talks to this idea that this is a watch to be worn, possibly, if based in the UK, a long way from home. Should we say that? But no, I was delighted, and we should speak of Tudor's Black Bay Pro.
I mean, just slightly slipping back to the Patek, you also got a black strap with it as well, so you'd got kind of the
to play off that dial.
Exactly that. Yeah, no, I think they did use the word galvanised in one of the meetings, and it was supposed to call to mind vintage cameras, the kind of dial effect like on an old Leica camera, was what they were saying, which it kind of does.
Yes, the finger, either the grip on the lens or possibly even the wrap, the vinyl wrap that would have gone around an old Leica. Which again talks to that idea of adventure and vintage. I thought it's actually, I think between that and the Solograph from Tag Heuer was probably, we'll come on to that, but it was probably my favourite watch of the piece. But other elements, I think what's interesting, what were the other standout moments? And this may be me, or it may be just how much time I spend on social media, but the Rolex launch annual, unlike 99% of brands, Rolex announced their watches once and once only. Now they announced I think they announced the stellar dialed perpetuals separately, but from memory you had to wait for Baselworld, and Rolex would then show you what they had, and they wouldn't basically show you anything again for a year. And there was no point in asking because you weren't going to know. So social media platforms got fascinated by this and spend half their time saying, what is Rolex going to do this time? And this, what is Rolex going to do this time, has become one of the beats of the watch calendar now. And I like watching the run up to it, and everyone just piles in saying, I hope they bring this back, or I hope they do this, or I hope they don't do that. And obviously last year we saw the Bicolor Explorer, which created a real regard and real interest. And of course this year I think they knocked it out of the park in terms of talking points, didn't they?
You got the teaser video as well, like I don't know, a couple of days before, which gave you a bit of a hint, and there was sort of wild speculation then, but it did look like it was going to be a GMT, but nobody expected a left-hander, did they?
Left-hander in green. And so that for me it was one of the sort of remarkable moments, and it puts Rolex slightly on the spot now, because each year they will come back, and it feels quaint now, but a Jubilee bracelet on a professional model. I mean, that was something that was top topic. Now it's been much more dramatic. I mean, I suppose the repurposing, if that's the right word, of the Air King. Yes. Out of an oyster case and into the
it's the
professional line.
It's assumed professional status.
So it's been given crown guards, it's been given the slab-sided professional case. It's now a fully fledged professional watch. Now, I think that's, again, it's topic A, isn't it, on all of the threads discussing Rolex. It talks to where Air King has been before, and now it talks to where Air King's going next, and that keeps people talking about Rolex. And as you describe it, the left-handed GMT Master, the Destro, as we're now calling it, again, was an unalloyed social media hit. I mean, the people could talk of little else. So that was one of the lifts, I think, of the fair. And I would say with Mark, I think notionally this idea that we are now regarding watches as absolutely essential to not just our everyday lives, but throughout our lives. And we're looking for pieces that really sort of fulfill our dreams for how we wish to spend that time.
And quite like what you said earlier, it's quite a romantic notion that the brands, whilst their production and when they start the concept years in advance, it's just worked very well that we've seen a lot of travel and exploration as we've come out the pandemic. So we'll say that they've led us into that just in a really comfortable way. But obviously these designs would have been happening way before then. But it's quite a romantic notion, isn't it? You know, now you're able to do something. Here you go. Omega, just before the fair, they launched the Speedmaster Ultra Deep. So on the theme of exploration, it's not the GMT, but that we were seeing, and also Grand Seiko with their Evolution 9. That was the they worked on a few GMTs this year, launched a couple of those.
Very nice pieces from Grand Seiko, and that talks back. Your point about Omega Faye talks back to innovation, because we saw the piece initially 3 or 4 years ago after its descent to the deepest part of the ocean, and 20 years ago we'd expect never to see that model again outside of a museum, and now it's on the market. It's commercial collection. And then when you look at what they've done with the 57 collection and brought a hand wound, sleek, 39.5. I mean, that's a stunning watch. So at the same time, and of course we all celebrated its arrival in another form, in another material, in another brand. And I'm talking of the launch of the Speedmaster Swatch collection, which although not apparent to elements of the watch world that would expect something like that to work the other way round, whether perhaps a brand may create a diffusion line. This is a brand taking an icon and placing it into the middle of a watch that sells for a 10th or less than a 20th of the value of the original model. It's impacted on the reputation of neither. It has only enhanced the reputation of both. So we're seeing that, you could argue, is innovation in marketing. I mean, there's been so much. I think people have really. It's not quite that the guardrails are coming down, but people are loosening the laces in their shoes and loosening their belts a little and saying we can experiment. You know, these are brands that we don't have fun with these, but we can experiment with them, and I think that's what's really coming through.
Yeah. And well, to your point about the Swatch Speedmaster, I mean, people obviously loved it. The queues. I mean, it was on the news, wasn't it? Literally about how many people were outside the boutiques waiting to collect.
Yeah,
that
and I think what's interesting about that, Mark. Sorry to interrupt you, but what was interesting is that that was deliberately intended to be a bricks and mortar moment.
Yep.
I mean, we have seen a lot of limited editions be sold in 5 seconds flat on the internet. Mm-hmm. But I think for both brands' purposes, it had to be something enshrined in a physical event, in the sense that the client had to come and present themselves, and as we know, that created problems of its own. But fundamentally, it was wonderful to after 2 years in which we've seen the shutters down in many cases. It's just so nice to see people queuing up to buy a watch. Yeah. So that for me filled my heart as well.
I was on Carnaby Street 2 nights before the launch, and the queues had already started. Yeah. I wasn't queuing 2 nights before, but it was wonderful to see, and the energy and. To your point about the price point, this wasn't something that was incredibly high value and very limited availability. It was they planned for these watches to go online at a later stage and be readily available. So it was a frenzy that I've not seen.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Faye, because normally they are strictly limited, thereby forcing scarcity, forcing aggro, shall we say. But in this case, not aggro, scarcity forcing demand. This is not a limited piece, so that talks to people wanting it and wanting it now, and that's what's changed, and not waiting. I mean, I promised myself we wouldn't talk about waiting lists, but I think fundamentally there are as much as there are some hen's teeth models which come with extraordinary waiting lists as a result, it's broadened people's horizons into perhaps models that they will happily or directly pursue in place of joining a waiting list. And I think with respect we can see certain models that have benefited from that.
Absolutely. Do you think though that's the demand of the watches and the availability of those hen's teeth pieces, or are consumers better educated?
Definitely the latter. It's not in lieu of. It's I'll have this. It's not I can't have that, so I'll have that. It's I wait for that, but in the meantime I'll wear this, and I have got no problem wearing this, as I had no problem waiting for that. I understand why I have to wait. The demand outstrips supply, forces of nature and industry. However, over here, I still want to wear a nice watch, and I understand much more. I think, with respect, a few years ago, people were much more monomaniacal and say, "I want that one," and and the world's grown up, and the world's learned so much more about watches and brands and watchmaking. I think, with respect, the Chronomaster Sport is the Zenith. Obviously, the El Primero served in the Rolex Daytona, so if that fact wasn't widely known a few years ago, it is relatively well known today. And the Chronomaster Sport arrives in a beautiful case, beautiful finish, beautiful construction with rose gold bicolours this year, and an El Primero movement. I mean, you don't have to make an apology to own a Zenith Chronomaster Sport. Of course you do.
You have to wait for one now.
Now, exactly, and Zenith is finding itself in the same position that Rolex are in. But so it only talks to this notion, as I said earlier, about the sort of the rising knowledge base that is really feeding the industry with I would suggest good advice, but also sort of demand, proper customer-led demand.
And also probably more disposable income, because people weren't travelling in the way they were for the last couple of years, and people have got a few pounds in the bank and think, well, why wait to do something? I'll buy a watch.
I think the consumer experience, from what I've heard from other sectors, is that there was a sense that I will do this when I turn this age, when I get that promotion, when I sell my business, when I sell my car and shop it in for something else, and now people just think, don't wait. I think our lives have been touched by so much in the last couple of years that people just say, no, this is something I am interested in. I'm committing this. Yeah, this is what I call permission to buy. I'm giving myself permission to buy.
But that aspect of immediacy also comes with its challenges, particularly in our industry.
Yeah, I think we were talking about Watches and Wonders, what it meant to particularly the media. I mean, we got so used to the idea that we were being fed information on the day of, that going to a fair, awaiting an appointment at a certain hour to be shown product before which we had no idea what might be there. Now we have pretty much the fairs collections dropped into our email boxes on the first day. So you could argue we don't need, but to your point, Faye, you can't get past meeting the brands, feeling the watches, just weighing the watches, just knowing all. You can't really pick up fine details or indeed quality unless you have the watch in your hand. But the knowledge base that the media has been predicated on the fact we've fed all of this information, and I think that is kind of what's educating people and educating them away from the idea that it's building demand. Definitely, it's creating a moment where, okay, I want it now, and brands have had to get a lot more savvy about when they communicate around product if they aren't able to supply. I can remember going to the fair, as you will well know, where we'd be showing watches that may not even make it into stores for until a year hence, because they hadn't actually ramped up production, nor would they until they'd met you, because they want to know exactly what you're interested in. But that caused problems, but it didn't cause those many problems because there wasn't that instantaneous social media alert to this watch has been made, and when can I have it? When can I have it? I used to tour with a colleague who used to surreptitiously, in some cases, go to Instagram Live. And as we were being shown the pieces, we would always check with the brands first, but he would sit there with his iPhone and I would do the meeting, and then occasionally I'd look over and the screen would just be scrolling and it would just say how much, when, how much, when. That was it. So I learned then that you can't tease the customer too much. You had to be prepared. And if you under-prepare, it may be deliberate for marketing purposes, but if you under-prepare accidentally, you'll be on the wrong side of history quite quickly. And the customer has choice now. They have the knowledge to make informed alternative decisions, and that's, I think, what's changed.
I think one of the things that maybe the lockdown did give us, though, was when we were having product launches throughout the year, and Breitling were particularly good at this, and Tudor, the product was available. Yeah. That whole anchoring your buys to one point in the year, as we did in the olden days, and waiting 6 months a year, 18 months for something to turn up, that did get a little bit fractured, and I think it's to the benefit that Tudor can talk about the launch of the Black Bay Pro, and it was in the stores on the day that the fair opened. So I think that's something that's probably a welcome change, really.
And the final point on Watches and Wonders and the general approach, I think, because we have got used to multiple launches throughout the year, I don't think that will stop now. I think whether or not we will be expected to travel or attend or indeed find routes to other affairs, I think individually the brands will as we've seen with brands such as Audemars Piguet step away from Baselworld, Audemars Piguet step away from SIHH. There are brands out there who will want to continue on that path. So there will always be now a rhythm to the year. But I do think Watches and Wonders, if it remains in its current format, will remain the sort of the keystone in the Norman Arch, as I say. Yeah, it'll be the moment. And then around it will proliferate. Particularly, we must not speak of the Swiss watch industry as the only watch industry, but it will proliferate around it, which will proliferate lots of individual brand-led events. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't seem to have affected consumer purchasing either. So some brands choose not to showcase at these fairs now, and haven't done for a while. So we're seeing it evolve, and we'll come on to sort of the new era and the new process and what we think is going on behind the scenes in Switzerland. But we're at the end of April, the 1st of April, we were still at the fair, and the Cartier Rondes we've got here were launched this year, and it's great to be able to see the product launched to your point, Bill. You're watching online or on social media, but it's not coming for another 6 months. There is a lot of product that we've got to wait for, but that continuity throughout the year and the storytelling, I think, it's interesting how the brands have constantly react and review how they work. It's okay that some brands will only launch once a year, but I think it's great that others, they're not in the same mould. There have been decisions to keep relevant, whether it's with capsule collections or limited editions throughout the year, which we know Breitling are very good at. But it's been interesting to see how they have evolved with it, stayed loyal, moved away, come back. It's fluid.
Yeah, necessarily so. I think as we described it, I think the industry has had to change because the routes to market are changing clearly, and I think structurally, I think some of the reasons why brands gathered in Baselworld, where I used to walk through the hall that contained all the machinery that made, in some cases, the machinery that made the machinery that made. So that seems to have, that heavy industrial side of the business is presumably moved entirely online and is or at least those events are frequented by far fewer people in far fewer numbers. But we're seeing a change at the heart of the industry, and it appears to me, I don't know how you feel about it, it appears to be looking out much more than perhaps it has done in the last 50 years. I think it seems much more of the world as opposed to serving the world. And I think, sorry.
Well, I was going to, I think it's probably there's a younger group of people in charge now. I think that maybe that's the direction. You know, the older guard in the who are in charge of the watch houses are retiring, and you've got some fresh blood coming in. Have got a different outlook and a different idea about how things should be. They probably respect the heritage of the brands, but they're willing to kind of tweak things a little bit.
So there's a youthful influence that are both you've just used the word respect, so respecting the loyalty and the integrity of where the brands are coming from, but equally recognise that it can't stay. Yeah. It can't stay.
Yeah.
Where it has been.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's certainly the generation that nursed and protected the Swiss watch industry through the quartz crisis have now, if they've not retired, are very much about to retire, which brings in a generation who, whilst being very aware of and very respectful of what they've been handed, given the work that was done to protect these brands, weren't directly connected at that point. So they come with fresh eyes, and also with respect. They're coming at a time when technology has not in no way supplanted the need for a watch, but has challenged the need for a watch. And so they're very aware, we are all aware, that this is a product that you buy with your heart as much as your head, and you buy it for many supplementary reasons to simply telling the time. And that brings a different discipline to how watches are designed and sold. And that isn't to suggest that the previous generation hadn't spotted that and weren't working towards that, but the new generation have this, I feel they don't seem to carry that burden of
that sort of
knowledge, exactly. The burden of history with them, and as we see at Tag Heuer, Frédéric Arnault is currently the CEO, and his brother Jean is at Louis Vuitton, and his brother Alexandre is at Tiffany. These are very young men, and they are coming with a great purview, given their position as members of the Arnault family, as to what the luxury world looks like and what it could look like and what it should look like, and therefore that's going to have its own impact, I think, on the watch industry. So I can't speak for the watchmaking fraternity, which is very local to the regions of Switzerland and beyond where watches are produced, but in terms of the wider business, the marketing business, for instance, you're seeing people join who haven't grown up around the watch industry. So they're bringing in attitudes and skills and ideas from outside into the watch industry, and that will only have one effect, which is to broaden again how the watch industry views itself and how it wishes to be viewed. So we're talking about newness. I wouldn't say this has all again happened in the last 18 months, but you're coming out of this forced abeyance when we weren't really allowed to focus on it. We were able to go to Watches and Wonders, and you saw lots of fresh faces, lots of new faces, and as Mark and I will attest, lots of younger faces.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely.